Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. Tonight, we are very pleased to have New York Times bestselling author Jon Katz. I'd like to thank Prairie Lights Bookstore for sharing Jon Katz with us and you. I've long admired his writing and his deep and heartfelt connection to his animals. In my imaginary world, don't we all have these wonderful imaginary worlds where we find a writer and a subject that we understand immediately? I see myself living at Bedland Farms and having all the animals I could possibly collect. But unlike Jon Katz, I would not have to do all the hard labor. Remember, this is my imaginary world. 10% of any purchase of tonight's books will go to the Iowa City Animal Shelter, and Mr. Katz will sign books after tonight's reading. Tonight's author is here to talk about Saving Simon, how a rescue donkey taught me the meaning of compassion. Jon has written 19 books. I just called you Jon, is that all right?
I can take that.
Okay, sorry.
Well, we missed you, John.
I got a little free with that. Jon has written 19 books, 7 novels,
I have to walk out of here now.
and 12 works of nonfiction, including Soul of a Dog, Izzy and Lenore, Dog Days, A Good Dog, and The Dogs of Bedland Farms. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, Rolling Stone, Wired, and the AKC Gazette. He's worked for CBS News, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Jon is a photographer, hence the camera, and the author of the children's book, Meet the Dogs of Bedland Farms. He lives on Bedland Farms in upstate New York with the artist Maria Henrich, his dogs, Roscoe, Izzy, Lenore, and Frida, and his barn cats, Mother and Minnie. Please help me welcome Jon Katz.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me? I think I have a mic so I can hear me. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm having a great time in Iowa. We're a little shocked at how nice people are here. And so we're unnerved because we have to go back to New York and we're kind of retool ourselves, get a little more aggressive. But it's been great. I was in Des Moines for the last couple of days and then Cedar Rapids today, earlier. And in Des Moines, Sunday, somebody brought a donkey to my reading there named Boswell. And they called me early and said, you're going to have a donkey there. And I told my neighbor, who's a farmer, there's going to be a donkey at my reading. And he said, oh, great. People in Iowa will see 2 asses in one day. So here I am, for better or worse. My wife, Maria, is over there in the end, and I'm happy to see her. And I happen to have a great friend, Julie Vogan, I've been emailing for many years, a follower of the blog. We've been through many ups and downs together. And it's so great to meet her. And I'm really thank you for coming, Julie. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about Simon, but I'm going to also talk about other things. I'm going to talk about sort of the future of animals in our world, which I've been writing a bit about. I'm going to talk about the human companion animal explosion in America and what it's all about. I'm going to talk about a concern about animals disappearing from our everyday life. I'm going to talk a little bit about the animal rights movement and the rescue movement. So we're going to have some good conversations. I love to take questions. So I'll talk for a while and talk about my work, shy as I am to do that. And feel free to get questions ready and ask me about them. I've had some great conversations around the country. Maybe I was working for CBS News, and that convinced me that I needed to get away from corporate media or I was going to perish. So I went upstate New York, bought a little cabin. I brought 2 dogs with me. And I was supposed to be writing a media book. And the woman who owned the bookstore there, Margaret Waterston, is a very plain-spoken Quaker, called me aside one day and said, you know, Jon, the stories you're telling me about your dogs are so much more interesting than the books you've been writing. You should think about that. So that rattled me a little bit, but I thought there was a lot of truth to it. And so I kind of broke my contract and wrote a book about dogs. And I liked that. I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was a huge opening for a writer to explore the relationship people had with animals. You know, in 1963, there were 15 million owned dogs in America. Today, there are 74 million owned dogs and 78 million cats. And the relationship between people and animals has just exploded. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that don't have a lot to do with animals. If you look back and look at how the growth of this culture, it began in the 60s when television became popular, when they built the interstates and families started moving around, and when the divorce rate went up, and when politics started to become a bit of a nightmare, and technology began to get more complicated and more expensive. The disposable worker became an issue in America. People started getting laid off, and the contract with corporations kind of was broken. So life became more stressful. And I think the institutions that used to sort of ground people, religion, politics, were beginning to erode. People began turning to animals more and more, I think, for unconditional love and for connection and for just emotional support. So I think the new work of animals really became supporting people and giving them the kind of connection they weren't getting. Now, these different parts of the country, this varies. You know, I think being in Iowa, people have a strong connection with the farm, with rural life, and with animals that's stronger than in many other places. You talk about this stuff in New York, it's really very different. You know, in the end of World War II, 80% of Americans still lived in rural areas. And now it's just the opposite. 80% are living on the coast. So people are disconnected from the natural world. They're disconnected from animals. And they're disconnected from a lot of the things that used to ground them. So I think that's very connected to the rise in animals. Here, I think people have a connection that's stronger, and they understand, I think, the real lives of real animals a little more closely. So it's just a bit of a general kind of what got me into writing about this subject. I'm very fond of animals, and we've had them, but it was mostly so I could write about them and learn about them and explore the issues relating to their relationships with people, especially. Mostly I write about the people who have the animals more even than the animals. I spent a year at the University of Kentucky when I wrote the new work of dogs, and we studied attachment theory there, where they have people come into glass rooms with windows and they watch them with their dogs, and they tell them what their mother was like. And it's pretty amazing. I learned to do this. You have to be careful when you do this. Because I think our whole relationships with animals, our emotional feelings of them, the way we treat them, are grounded in our own emotional lives. And nothing has been more interesting for me than watching how people react to animals, why people get the animals they get, why they need the ones, why some rescue them and some don't. And so that whole emotional territory between people and animals is very rich and great territory for me. And I've experienced this firsthand like a million times now. After my book, I wrote a book about being on the mountain called Running to the Mountain. And that really kind of opened me up to wanting to do this full time. I ended up buying Bedlam Farm, a 90-acre farm. And at the time I had a crazy border collie. I wrote a book about him called The Dog Year. And I was trying to figure out how to deal with him. And I went to this dog trainer in Pennsylvania who started teaching me sheep herding. That's what you do with crazy border collies. You give them sheep and you try to work things out with them. They're all crazy, but in different ways. And Carolyn Wilkie was one of those great trainers. And she didn't like people very much, but she loved animals a lot. She hated yuppies. If a yuppie pulled in the driveway, she would throw them off the farm immediately. And she didn't like the car, BMW, get out, get out. So I barely got through because I had a beat up old Volkswagen. It was a great experience. That kind of opened me up to being on a farm, to the ritual of herding, which I love, to the world of border collies, which border collies have a mind that's somewhat like mine, so we sort of connected with them. It's a little horrific. And I ended up meeting this donkey there, Carol, who was living in a little acre on an adjoining farm. She'd been there for 16 years. She'd never been fed. She just lived off of roots and bark and grass and rainwater. So I started bringing her apples. And she would bust right through the fence, chase the dogs and the sheep away, and run me down until I gave her an apple. And then when I moved upstate, I bought those sheep and ordered them, bought a trailer, rented a trailer to get them upstate. And the sheep arrived, and when I opened the trailer, the donkey popped out along with the sheep. And a note from the farmer said, "You like her so much, you could feed her." So I had a donkey. And so several weeks later, I got a phone call from a woman who said, "I have very bad news for you. I've driven by your farm, and I'm sorry to tell you that your donkey is unhappy." And this startled me, because I'm thinking, well, first of all, how would she know that? And secondly, why should I really care about that? If I was a real farmer, I would not really care. And I said, "Well, who are you?" And she said, "Well, I am a Jewish donkey spiritualist." Which are 3 words I never expected to hear in upstate New York or anywhere else. And I said, "Well, what is that?" She said, "Well, I'm a donkey mystic. I live with donkeys and I love them. And your donkey doesn't know she's a donkey. She is depressed." And I said, well, I guess you better come over here. And the farmers have been ridiculing me about this ever since, so I can take it. So she came over, and she was, in fact, a sort of a mystic. She raised donkeys, lived with them her whole life, and she was telling me that Carol was unhappy because she didn't know she was a donkey. She'd never been around other donkeys. And she said she wouldn't fulfill her identity if she didn't know that. And Carol was a kind of a grumpy creature. She wasn't that sweet, and the only way you could deal with her was to play Willie Nelson on a boombox. She loved Willie Nelson. As long as you were playing Willie Nelson, she was very calm and very sweet. Without that, it was mayhem. I came home once, and she had unlatched the gate to the pasture, come into the house in the back door. I was in the kitchen eating cereal from boxes that she'd opened up. And I started yelling at her to get out, and she looked at me like, make me get out. And it was tough. It was tough. I had to bang on pots for a while. So this is my introduction. When Pat came over and looked at her, I said, well, what's the solution to this problem? He said, well, she needs to have another donkey, which I happened to sell to you. So I bought a donkey. Okay, I'm just being honest with you. I can't tell the story to farmers up there. They laugh at me. So the other donkey showed up, and Carol had sort of a meltdown, went into the barn for a week. And when she came out, she was different. I think this woman was right. Of course, a couple years later, she died. She had a stroke and died. And then I had to get another donkey to keep this first one company so her identity would be secure. So I actually came to love these animals. Donkeys are wonderful creatures. They're very intuitive. They're very affectionate. They've been with people for thousands of years. They're very smart. They're very willful, a little bit like cats. Everything has to be their idea. And the way to get them to do something is to pretend you want them to do the opposite. They're like little raptors. They watch the gates and they unlatch them and eat the barn and just drive you crazy. But they're very sweet creatures, and so that sort of paved the way. 5 or 6 years ago, the New York State Police raided a farm, maybe an hour or two from mine, and they found this donkey in horrific shape. He was just about dead. He'd been starved for a couple of months. He was lying in mud and ice, and his teeth had grown to his jaw. His hooves were out like a foot on either side. He was walking on his ankles, and he had a rain rot and lice and infected eyes. It was a nightmare. And they were going to put him down. He was in such bad shape. And one of the troopers asked the animal control officer, but do you know anybody crazy enough to take a donkey like this? She said, well, I do, actually. There's somebody I can think of. So we ended up getting him. And it was a very powerful experience for me. He needed a tremendous amount of care. I had to reach into his mouth and rub his gums and put stuff on his eyes. I started to work on him. I hand-fed him hay. And I started reading donkey stories to him, like Plato and I and Don Quixote. He loved to be read to. He loved donkey stories. And there's this vast literature, and I know the library knows this, of strange men and donkeys wandering around. So I became one of the strange men and donkeys. And this very same farmer who told me this about coming to Des Moines went by in his truck one day, and I was walking with Simon, and he yells, "Two asses on the road." And so that was going to be the name of my book, but the publisher resisted that. Didn't like that idea. So we started the procedure of healing him, and he's a very sweet creature. He really wanted to live. He really responded. He started to get very well every day. I mean, he loved his medication. He let me take care of him, and accepted it and seemed to understand it. We actually had a very rich communication going, where I think I was able to make him understand that I was going to help him, and he accepted that. He let me do things to him that he could easily have kept me from doing. And he became an incredibly affectionate creature. He loved people. He loved to be around them. He loved attention. I'm sorry, I've been doing this all week, so I'm a little froggy. The book became an interesting experience for me because it became somewhat a story about an exploration of compassion. First, the compassion for him. I was putting up pictures of him on my blog, and they were pretty horrific. So he became a sort of international figure. And there was tremendous rage about the farmer and how the farmer could do that, and the farmer should be in jail. And I began thinking a bit about compassion and how compassion works. And I realized that the problem with compassion is that people only want to apply it to people they like, and they don't want to apply it to people they don't like. And those are the ones who generally need it. So I wanted to think a little differently about this, rather than just trash the farmer. And I take pictures of farms all the time. I've gotten to know a lot of farmers, and I think they're the greatest animal lovers in the world, really. And no one knows animals better than they do. and lives with them more closely. So I got very involved in this idea of going to see him and talking to him and exploring his reasons. I wanted to know why this happened, rather than just hating him or dumping on him or getting him arrested or having him shut down. So I went and knocked on the door, and I was just surprised. I found this person I really couldn't hate. He was just beat up. He was worn out. He really had no excuses for what had happened. He was very sorry about it. He was embarrassed about it. But I saw a person who had just been beat up. He was losing the farm. He was going broke. He was struggling, and he couldn't take care of this animal. And he was too embarrassed to call for help. And I thought it was a shame that there's not more help for people like this, because animal abuse often comes along with poverty. And if people could be helped a little more, I think animals could be helped a little more. So I went away from that not being in a rage about him, but having a better sense of how this happened, and dropping this kind of rage against people that often comes up in the animal movement. I don't think loving animals goes with hating people. I think one kind of is part of the other, and I've never met a content animal with an angry person. So the book became an exploration of some of those things. And I have a blog, bedlamfarm.com. It has a lot of traffic, about 4 million visits a year. And I share the life of the farm and the life with animals. And in our world, that's a controversial thing when you do that. You experience the dark side of Facebook. And there are a lot of people at computers who like telling other people what to do. And so I hear from them quite often. And I like that dialogue. There's a dialogue going on. I think there's a great schism in America now between people who have pets and people who have animals. And they're very different things. And I think people are losing touch one with the other. Every animal is not a pet, and every pet is not a domesticated animal. So I'll talk about that a little more. Simon had a great life. I was riding one day up a highway, and I saw this very beautiful woman standing in front of her farmhouse. In the back, an old pony standing in front of a collapsed barn. You guys had some terrible floods here a few years ago, and in upstate we had some terrible snow. And all the barns had collapsed in the snow from heavy roofs. And I saw this pony standing in front of a collapsed barn. I thought, this is a great New York State story and a picture. So I stopped and knocked on the door, and this very beautiful woman, she was 102, Florence Walrath, came out of the house and looked at me and my camera, and she said, "Oh, you want to take a picture?" She said, "Well, I'm deaf and the pony's blind." She said, "We're just writing it out together. And you can take a picture of him, but not of me." So Maria and I started taking care of the pony. He'd been living alone in the pasture for 15 years and didn't have any shelter, and there wasn't even a fence. He had his own life back there. He had his paths. And we started getting connected with him. And one day I went, and Florence came out, and she was 104 then. And she said, "Well, I fell down the stairs, and they want to put me in a nursing home. So I want to say goodbye to you." And I thought she was going to a nursing home. She died the next day. And she just wasn't going anywhere. That was her decision. She was not leaving that house, and she did not leave the house. So we looked around after she died, and we said, "Well, we really love this place." So we bought it and moved there. And we brought Simon there to the farm, and thinking that he and the pony would get along fabulously. Somebody's shaking their head. Every horse person I knew said they'll work it out. But this was not the case. And equines are very protective of the herd, and they especially don't want sick animals around, and because it's a threat to them. Predators, it draws predators. So Simon went after this pony very aggressively and ran into him and bit him and kicked him, and we separated them. But the pony was very, very old, and winter was coming, and he just began to lose ground very rapidly under the stress of it. He couldn't go where he usually went, and wherever Simon was, he was aware of him. They were separated. And so I got another lesson in compassion. The vet came and said, "You need to be compassionate. You need to put this pony down because it's another winter and he can't handle it." And so we did that, accompanied to great fury on the internet, I have to say, many thousands of emails. So the whole story became a kind of twists and turns about compassion, the different ways to view it. And the fact that I think in this country, we're always talking about being compassionate, but you don't see a lot of compassion in the world. You don't see it in politics. You don't see it in animal discussions. You just don't see it. And I think the message of Simon for me was to take it more seriously. And that was his legacy, I think, for me. I've gotten very involved in a bunch of other things in the last couple of years. I've been writing quite a bit about the New York carriage horses. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, the movement to ban them from New York. I kept seeing these stories about how abused they were and how cruel it was for horses to pull carriages. And so I was curious about it, so I went to New York to see them. And I was pretty shocked about what I found. I found that these horses were very happy and very healthy and very well cared for, and that nothing I had been hearing about them was true. I also began to awaken a bit to think about what is the future of animals in our world. You know, since 1970, according to the World Wildlife Federation, half of the animal species on the earth have disappeared. And in our country, we're driving many of the others away. From the elephants in the circuses to ponies in markets to horses in carriages. They're disappearing. And they don't have any place to go. And quite often when these animals are removed from their work, it's a death sentence for them. So I think if I were to push for a law, it might be that anybody who removes an animal has to come up with an idea for where they're going to go and who's going to pay for them. Because then our kids won't be able to see these animals. They'll be gone soon and nobody will know what they're like, which I think is a catastrophic loss for the world. So it's led me in some interesting directions writing about that. Also controversial, of course, which is one of my gifts. And it's, I have to say, it's a great dialogue because, you know, the internet has its ups and it has its downs. But I think the conversation is very valuable. I always learn from it. I'm always open to it. I think it's made me a better writer. It's made me a stronger writer. And I'm happy to talk about that. My book before this one was The Second Chance Dog, and it was about how this amazing dog, I called her the hell dog, Frida, brought my wife and I together. I'll tell you a little bit about the story of Frida. She was a Rottweiler Shepherd mix. I call her the dog who kept men away, was her idea. She and my wife were both inveterate man-haters and were holed up together, keeping men away. And Frida's job was basically to kill me. At the earliest opportunity and quickly as possible. So Frida's story, she's a big dog. I remember coming out of the farmhouse one day and she was sitting on a deer. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she just jumped off the deer. She didn't hurt it, she just was playing with it. So she was a lot of dog. And so my challenge here was, I knew Maria wasn't coming without the dog. So I had to figure this out. This was a crisis, this was a big crisis. Frida was a junkyard dog. She was purchased from a guard dog breeder in the Adirondacks and hired by somebody who had a junkyard in Glens Falls, New York. And she lived outside. She never was in a house. And her job was to patrol the fence and get crazy if anybody came near it. And she got out one night and got herself pregnant. And the owner of the junkyard drove her up to the New York State Thruway and dumped her off in the Adirondacks, where she lived probably not unhappily for 4 or 5 years, killing things and eating. And she made her way down to Glens Falls again, and it took the SPCA a year to get her. She was very wily, and she resisted traps and nets. The way they got her was they got a sirloin steak, and they laced it with sedatives, and that was her downfall. So she was in the shelter for maybe 9 months. And maybe hundreds, if not thousands of people came in and said, "I don't want that dog." Until my wife got in there. And she said, "Oh, she's adorable. I'd like to take her home." And the shelter said, "Just take her. You don't have to, we don't care if you have a fence. You don't have to pay a fee. Just take her right out the door." And she came right home with her. And so the terror began. And that's about the time that I met them. So my challenge was to get Frida to not kill me, first of all, and then to agree to live with me so I could be with Maria. So the year I call the year of the beef jerky campaign began. So I bought hundreds of dollars in beef jerky, and Frida, she had to be in a barn because she was trying to kill my dogs, she was trying to kill the donkeys, the chickens, and she tried to kill anything that moved, really. And I would open the barn door, and I'd throw beef jerky in and run. And this went on for months, and my theory was she's a dog, so she's an animal, and if you throw beef jerky at a dog long enough for many days, they're going to think you're not so bad. Sort of what happened. But it also led me into this other exploration. My next book is called Talking to Animals. And it's about communicating with animals. And it's about looking for a wiser and more mystical way to understand them and simply to see them as dumb beasts or as piteous and abused creatures, which I think is the way most Americans are beginning to look at them. I think we need a broader understanding of them than that if they're going to remain in our lives. And Frida was a great chance for me to explore this. I had an urgent motive to do it because I wanted to be with Maria. And I was just fascinated by her. She's a very powerful creature, a lot of prey drive. And I thought if I could do this, it would also be a breakthrough for me and my ideas about communicating with animals, which I've been working on for 15 years. That's going to be my next book. And that involves food, it involves emotions, it involves body language, and it involves visualizing. It involves talking to them the way they talk to each other, which is in images and changing images, which is the primary way they communicate with each other, which most of us don't know. And I did a lot of that work with Frida, and over time it was very successful. It took me 6 months to be able to put a leash on her. She would hold my arm in her mouth when I did that and consider whether to tear it off or not. And she didn't. And I was able to get her outside on a leash eventually and begin sort of obedience training and calming training with her. And I saw her begin to respond. She was still ferociously aggressive to animals and to some people and to me. And I had started having these dreams. I took her up to the Adirondacks to see how she would behave up there. And I started having these dreams, which I realized I came to believe were kind of coming from her. That we were out in the trail, we were out in the Adirondacks, she was running ahead of me. She would be in a clearing and I would catch up with her. And I heard this voice, I would say, what do I have to do to get you to go to the next level, to get you in the house? I wanted to get her in the house by Christmas Eve as a present for Maria. And Maria had a tough time with her being in the barn. We had to haul firewood out there and keep a wood stove going. And I heard this voice kept saying to me, you have to trust me. And I realized that was the one thing that I hadn't done. So on Christmas Eve, I got the leash on her and we walked across the road into the house. My dogs lined up in battle formation and they're all waiting for her. And she came in with her fur up. And this is a substantial dog. And I said, Frida, this is it, you know, it's gonna work or it's not gonna work. And she kind of looked at me and she looked at the wood stove. She went over the wood stove and lay down. And it was just a very simple of, I want to be here. You know, I've had enough. And she became just a great dog for me and for everybody. She never bothered anybody. She never hurt anybody. Maybe got a rabbit or a raccoon or two. And she ended up guarding my study. She would sit there with her legs crossed and protect me when I was working, and nobody bothered me, ever. So I'm excited about the next book. You know, I think this idea of communicating with animals and of seeing them in a more sophisticated way is really important. You know, at World War II, 80% of Americans lived in rural areas and on farms. Now it's just the opposite. And this is a problem because the people making decisions about animals don't really often know what they're like. And the people who used to make decisions about them live with them. And so I think we're seeing this enormous gap. The way we tend to look at them is really in terms of how we're mistreating them and only. And that's a real problem, that's a legitimate issue. But beyond that, if we want to keep them in the world, if we want to keep them, we have to do better than that. And so I think one way to do it is to learn how to really communicate with them. And dogs are a great thing to look at because dogs are in trouble because of the intensity of our feelings about them. The leading cause of death for dogs is now overfeeding. There are 400,000 dogs in America on Prozac and antidepressants now. Dogs went 20,000 years without Prozac. And why do so many need it now? It's because we're making them crazy. And we keep thinking they're just like us and we keep projecting our stuff into their heads. So there's a lot of urgent reasons to think about them and think about what they're actually like. They don't have words, they don't have language, they don't have our narrative stories in their heads. So you really can't communicate with them that way. You know, I think dog training is a catastrophe in America right now. It's all about these $40 videos and books that tell people to do things they can't do. And then they feel dumb and give it up. You know, the American Veterinary Association says only 3% of dogs are trained at all. And many of them don't know their names. And so I think there's some urgency to sort of thinking a little more clearly about how we get them and how we talk to them and how we listen to them. So those are interesting things for me to be writing about. I've also got another dog I should tell you about. Some of you may know about him, Red. the Border Collie. And this is an interesting story for me. I know I lost a couple of Border Collies. Rose died, and Izzy, my first hospice therapy dog, died. And Izzy was a dog who was abandoned on a farm in upstate New York. And somebody called me about him, and we went to find him. And he'd been running in circles for months, dig a 2-foot trench in the ground. And we eventually caught him. And he, of course, drove me crazy for a while, as Border Collies will do. And he played what I call Border Collie chess. You know, he would dig a hole under the fence, and you'd fix that, and he'd go over the fence, and he'd go through the fence, and I think he'd get hold of some tools and unscrew the fence. But he eventually settled down and became a hospice therapy dog. And I got my real powerful window into the impact animals have on getting people to talk and open up. At the end of his hospice career, and we spent a lot of time in the Adirondacks going to these very remote places where people were dying, and seeing Izzy was the most important thing for them. They would talk to him in a way they wouldn't talk to nurses or doctors. I got this call one day, the phone rang, and I picked it up. It was the manager of a dementia unit where we had been going. And the manager says, "Is Izzy there?" And I said, "Well, Izzy can't come to the phone right now, you know, he's a dog. And he's probably talking to his agent at the moment." And I said, "Can I help you?" He said, "Well, we have a riot in the dementia unit. We have a huge food fight going on. People are throwing food at each other, and the nurses are hiding in the hallway. And you could hear the screaming and shrieking in the background." I said, "Well, that's awful. Why are you calling me exactly?" And he said, "Well," I said, "I want to call the sheriff because somebody's going to get arrested. We were hoping Izzy would come." And I said to myself, "Well, you have to be like an idiot to take a Border Collie into a riot in a dementia unit." So we immediately went there. And we went roaring in there, and like the cavalry, and Izzy went running in, looked around, saw the ringleader, ran up to him, put his head on his knee, and everybody stopped, and they all forgot that they were fighting, and peace reigned. And so I had the only Border Collie in history who quelled a riot in a dementia unit. Whatever good that's going to do me, I'm not quite sure. So when Izzy passed away, I missed that experience. I loved doing that kind of work. And he was a very intuitive therapy dog. So I got an email, you know, the internet brings good and bad things. And it said, "You know, you don't know me, but I was in Ireland. I found this wonderful dog on a farm who was really getting beat up. I took him off the farm. I brought him to Virginia. I rehabilitated him. And I read one of your books. It was about Izzy doing hospice work." And she said, and then God spoke to me. And he said, "You have to give this dog to Jon Katz." So I have to say, this was not good news to me. Because suddenly God was involved in my dog. I didn't think that was good. I thought, what if it didn't work out? And I didn't really want God to get involved in it. So I told her I thought she was crazy. I was nice to her, but I said I thought she was crazy. And she was very determined. She kept sending me videos of him and pictures of him and stories about him. She was very clear, and she also seemed very nice. So after like 50 or 60 videos, every day my day would begin with a video of Red. And he's a beautiful dog, and he was doing a great job with the sheep. And so I said, "Well, let me talk to you." So I called her up. And she's a minister. You know, I realized just because you believe you're religious doesn't mean you're crazy. You have to remember that. And I liked her. She's very nice. She was just a very grounded person. She got this dog. She read my book, and she felt very strongly that I should have this dog. This dog was right for me. She wanted him to be a therapy dog. I had sheep, so he was great with that. And she was not going to take no for an answer. This is just the way it should be. So I came to really like her. We became good friends. And so a friend of mine was going through Virginia and brought Red back. And the thing about the story, you know, she was absolutely right. This was absolutely the dog for me. He's great with sheep. He's an amazing farm dog. And he's become a therapy dog. And we're working with veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's extraordinary with them. On our last visit, he went to a unit where a young man from Iraq who had been injured in a head injury in one of those explosions. And he hadn't talked to anybody in a year or so. He wouldn't speak to the doctors, and he wouldn't speak to the nurses. And we came into this unit where he was, and he saw Red, and he dropped to the ground, and he started crying. And Red crawled into his lap, and they sat there together for a half an hour or so. And he was crying, and the nurses were crying, and the doctors were crying. And he just started talking. He started talking to Red, and he started talking to the nurses, and he really started moving in his healing. So the power of animals to do that is extraordinary. You know, so many people and I've seen, and we do a lot of dementia work, respond to that. One woman saw red and said, you know, you used to be such a cute little poodle, and look at you now. You're just a big red dog. And then she started talking Gaelic to him, and he responded. You know, he'd obviously been trained somewhat in Gaelic, and he seemed to know that, and it was actually very helpful to me in training him. I don't know how she knew that, but she picked it up from him. So these are very rich experiences for me. I think they've opened me up. They've taught me the power of animals. They've opened me up to the idea of animals and spirituality. I'm very, very interested in the communicating work that I've been doing and Maria's been doing. I want to write about it. So that's a book that's taken like 15 years to do. I think it'll be out next year. And that's pretty much where I am in my writing life at the moment. I think it was a great thing for me to go there and get this farm and begin this life with animals. You know, I was very, very fascinated by what I've learned with attachment theory, by the reasons people get animals, what they mean to them, what it says about their emotional lives. So that's the part of animal writing that has not much been explored. You know, there's a lot of, the most popular animal book in America, in the world, is The Rainbow Bridge. Some of you may know the story of The Rainbow Bridge. It sold 200 million copies, which I'm somewhat bitter about, I have to admit. And it really, the idea behind the bridge is that when a dog dies, it goes to heaven and is healed. And when you die, you join the dog there. So when a dog dies, people say, oh, I'm going to see him on the bridge. I keep having nightmares about dying and going to heaven and having 10 border collies waiting for me with a bunch of Frisbees and spending all eternity throwing things at them. And they would outlast me. I just don't want to do that for them or for me. So maybe I'm just not spiritual enough, but I think if that's what it takes to sell 100 million copies, I'm just not going to do it. So let me take some questions from you. I think I've covered some of the basics. And I think we're going to have some help with questions here.
So if you have a question, I will hand you the microphone because we are live on Library Channel 20 and we will re-air this and we'll stream it. So if there are other people who you think should have been here tonight, you can tell them that we will make it available.
My question is, you were talking about compassion. Sorry, I get a little emotional when I talk about this. A lot of us have compassion for dogs and cats. We don't think anything about farm animals, and they have the same emotions. They have the same sensory system. They feel pain, and 98% of them are on factory farms, never see sunshine, never go out on grass, live horrible lives, and then we kill them. And the truth is, we don't even need to eat meat, dairy, or eggs. We choose to. We know enough about nutrition that we don't need to do that. And I just don't understand how we can love dogs and cats and treat the other animals the way we do when it's not necessary. And I wonder your opinion on that.
Well, I agree with you. I think the real abuse that I'm aware of is factory farms, industrial factory farms. I don't feel that way about most farmers. The ones that I know, I think, love animals quite a bit. And we live in the culture we live in. I mean, there are people who want to eat meat, and I don't exist to tell people what to do. It's just not what I do. And there are a lot of people who feel comfortable telling people how to live and what to eat and what to do. I'm just not one of them. I totally agree that I think the major issue that I know about abuse is the horrific conditions of corporate farms, many of them. And I think that's horrible. And I think that's a perfectly appropriate issue to talk and legislate about. I'm not as comfortable with the individual persecutions going on of people who live with animals. The informers and people arresting them and trying to take their property and hauling them into court. You know, I think that bothers me. So I guess we probably have a bit of a difference on that. And I don't think abuse is the whole story of animals in our world. I think there's a lot of abuse and it's important, but that's not the whole story. It's not the primary way in which I look at them. I think the issue is complicated. And I think I think people have a right to pursue any movement they want. I personally don't tell other people what to do. I just don't do it. So I don't know if that's a good answer for you or not. But I respect what you're saying. The stuff I've seen on the corporate factory farms is just horrific and inexcusable. And I would be much happier with the animal rights movement if they stopped those rather than chased after farmers who have cows have snow on their backs. My neighbor, every time his snow falls on his cow, they call the police and they come and try to arrest him. You know, it's like, I'm writing about a farmer named Joshua Rockwood, who's a really nice kid who started a local food movement farm. And when it was 27 degrees, minus 27, his water tank froze. And the police descended on him, somebody informed on him, and he was arrested, and his horses were seized. Now, this could be any farmer in the Northeast, including me. My water tanks froze. When it's minus 27 degrees, things happen on farms. So I think a lot of people, it bothers me that old people are having trouble getting dogs. The people who work in New York can't get dogs. People who don't have tall fences can't get dogs. And it bothers me. It bothers me what happened to Joshua, who's fighting for his life on his farm, because I wish somebody had come to his farm and helped him and said, can we get you some water, as opposed to arresting him and hauling him into court. The same day he was arrested, the town court water froze and sewage backed up all over the place. And I called up and asked him if anybody had been arrested. And he said, for what? I said, it's the same thing. So I think the issue is just nuanced. I think it's very hard. I think it's dangerous when people start getting very righteous about other people and start using animals to hate people. It just bugs me. So thank you for the question. Some other question?
How about
Julie, we have to wait for the mic. Behave yourself, Julie. It's more trouble.
I wanted to know about the carriage horses and where that stands right now.
Well, the carriage horses are a great story to focus on. The mayor has introduced a bill in the city council to ban them. And so the council is waiting to vote on that. The vote's supposed to come in July. It's interesting issue. 70%, 67% of the city wants the horses to stay. And the mayor believes that it's abuse for a carriage horse to pull a carriage in Central Park. And that's cruel for an animal to do that. An animal should not be working for people or entertaining people or whatever. I think the carriage drivers, it's a wrenching to see what's happened to them. Some of them have died of heart attacks. They're afraid they can't get mortgages. They're not going to know if they're going to have jobs. So this is going on for years. And some of them have died of heart attacks. Some of them have turned to alcohol or drugs. So it's gone on for about 10 years. What really drew me into it and what really shocked me is I went to New York thinking that I was going to see a bunch of abused animals. And I was just profoundly shocked to learn that almost everything I was hearing about them was false. They live longer than horses anywhere else. They've worked for 10,000 years in cities. They don't have any respiratory problems. They've never killed a New Yorker in 150 years. In Central Park last year, 3 New Yorkers were killed by bicyclists. And nobody's banning the bikes from New York. So I just think this is kind of inverted morality. And for one thing, I believe very strongly that the horses should remain among people. People really connect with horses. They've always been among people as long as there's been a country, and thousands of years before that. Now, it's very interesting personally. I went through a kind of weird, strange spiritual experience with the horses. I don't have a horse, and I was not very interested in horses. I mostly read about dogs and other animals and attachment theory. But when I started going to New York and I met the carriage drivers and I saw them, I got interested in it. And I had this strange sensation that every day that the horses were speaking to me, which I say to you is a strange thing. It's not generally something I would say publicly or believe. But every morning around 2 or 3 o'clock, I would get these messages and I would go write something. And it started getting a huge response and a huge audience and a lot of attention. And I thought I was actually losing my mind. I kept saying to Maria, I think these horses are talking to me. That's so weird. So I told this to some of my friends I'd made in the carriage trade. And they called me up one day and said, there's a Native American chief, Averell Looking Horse, who has been reading my blog. And he thinks that the horses are talking to you. And I said, oh my God. And he wants to meet you. And he really wants to meet people. He doesn't like to talk to people. He doesn't like white people particularly. And he thinks that our culture has forgotten its connection to animals. And that when that happened to the Native Americans, their whole world fell apart. And so the message of the horses is important. So I said, okay, so this is getting stranger. I went to New York to meet him. He's an extraordinary man, very handsome. He just looked like a movie, Geronimo, really. And he was so striking looking that we sat in Central Park, and maybe 25 or 30 people started to gather around us and sit down to wait for us to speak, like I was the oracle from Delphi or something. And the chief doesn't like to speak directly. He waits a while, he's comfortable, and then he speaks. And he looked at me eventually and he said, you know, the horses are talking to you. The horses have been praying for you to speak for them, among other people. And they've called you to keep them in the world. They don't want to leave the world, and they don't think it's good for people. They're calling for you to write about them, which is sort of what I had been thinking. And I couldn't really explain why I was so drawn to the story in the first place. And he said, you don't need to believe it, you just need to accept it. He said, there are just some things in your culture you don't understand. In my culture, people have been talking to horses for thousands of years. It's not a big deal. It happens all the time. And the Western culture has forgotten this. So it became a very powerful spiritual. I was very connected to him. I thought he was incredibly impressive and very direct, and I was very rattled by it. But I kept writing about the horses, and they become a part of our lives. We're getting a horse. Maria's getting a horse. And I believe what the chief said. I came to really see what he was talking about. It's not quite as strange as I was thinking about it. Being around the horses has been a very powerful experience for me. They do speak, they do communicate. I think we are powerfully connected to them, and I think we get rid of them at our peril. And I think that as the animals are vanishing from the world in this very continuous belief that they don't belong with people, that work is cruel, that entertainment is stupid tricks, and that, you know, I used to love the stupid tricks I used to see animals do. I think that's very elitist to denigrate all the things they do with people as being a stupid trick. So I think that experiences, you know, I'm a male, of course, and I think men are more resistant. I think women understand this more intuitively than men do. My wife was not surprised by it. She didn't think it was weird. She talks to animals all the time and doesn't think that much of it. But I think for me, it's been a more difficult journey, accepting it and opening up to it. It's also been a very beautiful one. So the thing about the horses in New York is they're putting up a huge battle. All the newspapers have supported them. The labor unions have, the Chamber of Commerce, 66% of the people. And the mayor, who has never had a dog or a cat, is clinging to this position. And I don't know what's going to happen to it. I think eventually, probably the real estate developers will get the horses before the mayor does, because the land and the stables are so valuable. But you know, this is a way of life. These people have been doing this in their families for 1,000 years, some of them, from Ireland and other countries. And recently, one of them, Maria and I went to New York, and one of them was a carriage driver, was an Israeli who grew up in Israel on a farm with horses, is now a carriage driver, and he wanted to thank me for writing about them. So he took us for a midnight ride in Central Park, which was just an amazing experience. The park was completely deserted, and this beautiful horse, and we clopped through the park for 2.5 hours. And at some point, some kid came out of the woods with a violin, was playing the violin, and he hops in the carriage. So serenaded us with Beethoven for a half an hour. And Ariel gave us tea and fruit, and we stopped at all these places I didn't even know existed. And he was talking the whole time about the power of the horses, the message of the horses. He takes the horse every morning to meet handicapped kids in the park. And these kids I met some of them, and they say that the reason they're alive is him. They come live for the horses, and the horses talk to them all the time. So I started meeting other people who talk to the horses. So we may be crazy, but there seems to be a little community there. So I think it's been just a powerful writing experience for me. I'm very committed to it. And I've done a lot of research on it. And these quite shocking statistics about, you know, there's no carriage driver is being accused of abuse. There's no evidence that horses are being mistreated. I think some have over time. I'm sure some, they're not saints. But it's an injustice. I think these people are about to lose their way of life and their livelihood, and they haven't done anything wrong. So I think it's wrong, and I think it speaks to this whole idea about animals, that we can't just get rid of them all the time because we can't trust people to have them. If somebody abuses an animal, you know, arrest them and punish them. Otherwise, let people work with them as they have forever, and don't take them away from everybody. I hate to think of a world where this young man will never see a carriage horse ever in his whole life. So I think that answers your question. Thank you. Thank you.
Do we have another question? As I walk over, I'm going to ask you my question about how...
You can't ask a question.
Well, then I'm going to make a statement. I can't imagine having an animal and not talking to it. I mean, everybody, you had talked to your animals. I mean, I talk to my animals all the time.
Well, let me speak to that. Everybody talks to their animals, but that doesn't mean they're communicating with them. You know, and if you look at the story of dogs in particular, we're always throwing a lot of words at them, but that doesn't mean that they understand what they're telling us. I mean, the reason only 3% of American dogs are trained is they don't understand what people are telling them. The American Veterinary Association did a huge survey finding that about 3% of dogs had even a minimal level of training. And most of them didn't even know their names. They thought their names were Susie, I'm going to kill you, or come here. So throwing words at a dog, which is what people do, which is what I do, is not the same as communicating with them. It's throwing words at a dog. They don't speak in words. They don't think in words. They know some words. They learn some words. But that's not their language. It's not, human words are not their language. So to communicate with them, you have to know that. And it's not about talking to them. It's about communicating. It is very, very different. That means making sure they understand you and making sure you understand them. It means listening to them as well as talking at them. It's not about obedience. It's not about seeing them as just piteous creatures that need to be rescued. Sometimes it's about that. It's about seeing them as partners. They share our lives. You know, my Border Collie and I share our lives together. We work together. You know, I respect him as that. When I communicate with him, I very rarely use words. You know, if you have a Border Collie, every year some national magazine does a cover story about 10,000 words they know. This year it's 2,000 words. Last year it was 1,500 words. My Border Collies basically need to know, lie down and get the sheep. And otherwise I communicate them differently. So they don't have language, and they don't have the narrative voice that we have about stories. They can't tell the stories that we have. So talking to them begins by not using words, and by not thinking that throwing words at them is communicating. So this human instinct, the more we love them, the more we want to see them as being like us. And we assume they think like us. People are always telling me what their dogs are thinking. He's jealous, he doesn't want me to go on vacation, doesn't want me to go to work, doesn't like my boyfriend. You know, and this is not communicating. This is projecting. And that's why 400,000 of them are on Prozac, because we're putting our crap into them. So I think it's a great question, but I would challenge the idea that by speaking to them, we're actually communicating. If that's an answer.
Yes,
Okay.
since it was a statement on my part. But, so someone here had a question?
I wondered if Red was in a movie. In the first YouTube
Not yet.
video.
Oh, he was in videos.
You posted when you first got Red, the first thing that Dr. Karen Thompson said to Red was, "You did good in Alone Yet Not Alone."
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. He was in a movie. That's
that
right.
was filmed in the same county as her facility is.
Yes, absolutely. Karen does movies, lets her dogs out for movies. So he had a bit part as a herding dog.
Did he make it into the final film?
I don't think so. I don't know. I don't
The
think
cutting
so.
room floor.
I don't think so. He
And
probably will have a movie made about him, I think.
with that stuff. And are you going to go down to visit her? in
She's
the
going to come and
future?
visit us. She wants to come visit us. Yeah, she's really a great person. I had a great story about her that she, I guess she's about 70 now, and she had an incident someday where her husband had some stuff on her computer that he didn't like, so she took it to a divorce lawyer and dumped him. And then she decided to give up men for a while. And then she went online on Match.com and looked for another partner. And she found a retired federal judge. And she called me up one day and said, "You're a Jew, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." That's usually not a question that's followed by anything good. And she said, "Well, I'm in love with a Jew." And so he got on the phone and asked me all kinds of questions about my ancestors. And she's just a great open character. I've really come to love her. And I'm very grateful to her. So she's great. And she herds the sheep every day. I'm sorry.
Do we have more questions? Oh,
Keep you going back and forth.
I just wanted to comment on the horses. I didn't realize how big a deal that was, but I remember when I was 12 years old, we moved to Oklahoma. And the first thing that I saw was these big, I don't know the name of those horses, those big.
They're draft horses. They're just draft.
Yeah, and the sheriff was on top of one, you know, and they rode horseback, bare horseback in our neighborhood. And I just thought that was really cool as a kid. And then I remember in 2000, I lived in New York, upstate, Albany, and that's the first thing I saw was a cop on a horse. So yeah, I think that's really an interesting thing that you're doing this on.
Well, thank you. I spent a lot of time watching kids come up to the horses and seeing them interact with them. And for many of these kids in New York, it's the only time they've ever seen an animal like that.
Yeah.
And seeing the impact it has on them. You know, there isn't a kid on earth who wouldn't vote to keep them there. And unfortunately, those are the kinds of voices that are dismissed and are not heard in the discussion. But I think it speaks to the issue very powerfully of understanding what they're actually like. These are horses who have never lived in the wild, wouldn't last for an hour in the wild, and would be set upon by predators, get disease, they couldn't find enough food. And they're probably the luckiest horses in the world because they're cared for every day and they're treated and a vet comes every week and they live a long time and they're all very sound. So there's this strange way of looking at animals. Lots of people can only see them as being pitiful creatures. You know, when a horse lowers its head, it doesn't mean that they're depressed. It means they're relaxed. And when they raise a hock, a rear leg, it means they're at ease. And people in New York often say the horses are depressed because they're lowering their heads. Now, that would not have happened if more people were among horses and knew them. So I think the question is, how do we keep them in the world and educate people as to what they're actually like again? I don't know if it's possible when so many people are no longer living near animals. And if this conversation would be very different in New York City, it has been very different, or in urban areas where people are so disconnected from the natural world and from the life of animals that they really don't think any of them should be around people anymore. And that's kind of where it's going, I'm afraid. But thank you for the...
I also wanted to comment on, I have a dog. I don't have a donkey or a horse, but I have a dog. And, you know, it's my first dog. And I've had her for 5 years. She hasn't died yet. And I have a heck of a time communicating with her. I remember saying to her, "Why don't you talk to me?" And I it just came out, like you said, you know, I communicate with her and I love her every day, but it's just like we want to hear from them. But I know that, I guess blinks, the way they blink is a sign of a communication. Their ears are a sign of communication where they, you know, where they have a submissive look about them. But I'm still trying to figure out how to.
Well, I think your dog is talking to you all the time. I think they're always talking to us. I think it gets back to that thing of you're expecting words, and you're not going to get words. But they're communicating all the time. They're very aware of our feelings. They're very aware of what we want. You know, people get the dog that they need as a rule. Dogs have adapted better than other species by becoming what humans want them to be. You know, there's a reason why dogs sleep in bed and raccoons don't, because dogs know how to look at you and project emotion and connection. Again, it's often instinctive rather than conceptual.
Right.
But that has been their great adaptive technique. Dogs have been, maybe next to cats, the most successful animals in the world, living with humans who can't live with anything. And they do it by communicating. When your dog is looking at you, they're communicating with you. When they're responding to you. I think if you let them, they eventually, and you're patient and you're clear, they will do what you need them to do. They'll become what you need them to become. And they'll attach to you in that way. But they're talking to you all the time. You have to recognize what they're doing is communicating.
So you're basically saying that my dog can read my psyche.
Your dog can sense your emotions, I wouldn't say rather than read your psyche. They can smell emotions, they smell fear, and they have a lot of emotions, they just don't have our emotions. And you know, they're very complex creatures, but they don't think like us. And they don't have emotions in the way that we do. They don't do envy, and they don't do revenge, and they don't do, you know, a lot of the petty things that human beings do. They're not erotic in that way, unless we make them so. But I think you have to really listen to them, and think about it in a different way. You know, it's very hard to communicate with an animal without removing the idea of language and words. That's the hard part. But we can talk about that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, one more question.
My dad used to farm with horses,
Uh-huh.
and he would talk about that they wanted to work, that they knew that it was time to be hitched up and go. And if they, weren't going that day, they would still pair up and be ready to go. Is that conditional, or?
Well, if it's a working horse, it's like a border collie. They live to work, and they need to work. To me, it's one of the cruelest things to do to a working animal is to deprive them of work. To take these horses out of the stables and send them to a preserve where they'll do nothing for the rest of their lives but eat hay and drop manure is not, to me, humane. I think it's just a new kind of abuse. But working animals, and there's a particular breed of working creatures, these draft horses, these farm horses, have been doing this work for 10,000 years. And they're bred to work, they're built to work, they need to work. Their bodies really atrophy and they get crazy and weird, just like a border collie does. If the border collie doesn't have anything to do, they begin to deteriorate and get crazy. And I think it really means rethinking our ideas. People are redefining abuse all over the place. It's not abuse for a working horse to work. It's what a working horse does. And of course you want them to be well cared for. And it's not abuse for a farmer to have a frozen water tank. That's just life. And I think we're losing the difference in the culture because we only see them as through the prism of abuse increasingly. Because that's what makes people feel good, to rescue something. And there's nothing wrong with rescuing something. It's a beautiful thing to do. But if it's the only way you look at an animal, you're just distorting the whole relationship of human beings. So now if you look at it, they're driving the ponies out of the farmers markets, the elephants out of the circuses, chickens off of farms. Wherever horses are, they're being picketed and protested, and people are being hauled into court. And farmers will tell you, I have a farmer down the road from me, and when it snows, he has to get his cows in the barn because somebody's going to call the police because a cow is standing in the snow every time. And so people are just getting so disconnected. I imagine it's a little better here because I think people are closer to that world. I'm not sure, but I think it's probably better. But back home, it's getting pretty intense. But no, I think in the case of a working horse, they really need to work, and they're excited to work. If you go to the carriage stables in New York, they can't wait to get out. And pulling a light carriage for a 2,000-pound horse is hardly work. On asphalt, on flat ground in Central Park, that's not bad work. I wouldn't mind doing it myself, a little bigger.
My dad used to talk about when tractors first came on the farms, and he always enjoyed going out and pulling them out with his horses.
Yeah. Well, there is a movement among young farmers to bring those draft horses back because they're good for the environment and they're less expensive.
Good for the soil. They don't compact it down.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
One more thing.
Go ahead.
Just Willie Nelson, no Waylon Jennings, no Merle Haggard.
No, I tried some other people. No, only Willie Nelson. She was just very loyal to him, and she just would become like a little kitten.
One last question.
I would bring her oats, and I would eat granola bar, and she would eat the oats. It was very nice. It was our closest moments together.
I actually never actually had a chance to get close to horse until last summer, because my boyfriend's auntie had cancer, and but her kids was doing radio like back to South Dakota, and I think 2 weeks before she passed away, and it was the last radio went with her, and her daughter was performance in that rodeo, and they got a first place, very good and 2 weeks ago she passed away, and it was a really sad story, but the whole family, I was surprised to see how the whole family as a whole being together to care about those horse, and the horse give them compassion to cancer, give them compassion to life, which actually really actually touched me, and she's a great person. And to me, first time I start realize how animal and how the whole family can be together just through the animal, all the time they're on the phone, they're talking about how is she doing and how the rodeo going, rodeo sort of becomes something they're brought them together, and the horse becomes something brought them together to be with each other and to go over what they have been through. And I really appreciate they showed me that, which I live in East Coast too. I live in Pennsylvania. It's really close to Allentown. But I don't see so much like that until I moved to here, because a lot of like farm base, you know, like, but her daughter is only like my boyfriend's niece is like cousin's only like 12 years old. So like her connection with animal, which I actually feel I never had in my life. So do you think like our occupation and our age and the place we live actually shaped our view of animal and limited our ability to have those connection with animal? What do you think of this?
It's a good question, thank you. Yes, I do. I think animals have always had a very powerful impact on people. I remember I got interested in animals in the first place when I saw an elephant in a circus. And it was, that would be considered a stupid and abusive trick, but it was a very powerful experience for me to see how animals and people could work together and do things together. It was amazing to me. I think we're losing that. I think a lot of people, behaviorists, psychologists, naturalists, have warned against the impact on humans of being disconnected from animals. They help us be grounded, they help us work, they help us feel good about ourselves, they help us in a lot of spiritual ways. And I think if you talk to the Native Americans, they would say that much of the problems we're having in our culture comes from being disconnected from animals. In the case of taking animals like the horses and banning them from the city and taking them away from people who work with them and love them, it would be both cruel to them and to the people in the city, being deprived of just the experience you're talking about. I've seen in the hospice work just the amazing impact a dog will have on a sick person or a dying person. I saw an awful lot of people leave the world saying goodbye to Izzy or Red rather than a person, and finding so much peace and comfort at being with them at the edge of their lives. I'm amazed by that. I was shocked by that because I hadn't seen it either, really. So I think we're, you know, someone named Boris Levinson wrote this book in 1963. He was a psychologist in New York, and he said Animals and Human Behavior. Animals and Human Behavior was the title. And he said that Americans were becoming disconnected from animals and were suffering. They were broken. That they were forgetting how to talk to animals and understand them and be around them. And he said that that would become a real problem around the turn of the century. They would begin turning to animals desperately to reestablish that connection with the natural world. And I think that's happening. I think you have just tens of millions of people are really eager to be with animals. But at the same time, they're not being with them in that way. It's a very dependent relationship to have a pet. It's one kind of experience. The larger experience of being with animals in the world is just gone for most Americans. So the kind of beautiful thing you're talking about, people are being disconnected from it. I personally think it's an awful thing. I even see the impact my donkeys have had on people who see them. I had a woman came who was pregnant. Her two donkeys just surrounded her and sniffed her stomach. And they were sensing what was going on inside of her and had an enormous impact on her. I have a friend who, whenever he gets crazy or depressed, comes over and just sits with the donkeys. He does Tai Chi with the donkeys. He had me doing Tai Chi with Simon, and Simon would lean against my back and keep me from falling over when I would. So those are beautiful experiences. They've altered my life in 100 ways. I think Maria would say the same thing. And I would be just so much of a lesser person without that experience. I feel badly that so many people are not having it. When I come to a place like Iowa, it's very interesting because a lot of people do have it. And you got a lot of people who nod their heads because they know what I'm talking about. But most of the country, they don't. And the only way they can experience animals is to think of them as not being worthy of being with humans. That humans are only evil who hurt them. And that's become the way we're seeing them. And so I think that's not a good thing. But it's a good question, and thank you for it.
Well, and thank you. So would everyone join me in thanking Mr. Katz?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.